Next session is a slightly different format. As you'll see, it is more focused on politics, and it's in conversation. So we have two participants. I'll introduce them both together. One, a former diplomat, James Watt, and a journalist and writer, Nadia, Turki. Is it pronounced Turkey or Turkey? Turkey. Turkey, okay. Turkey. First of all, James. So James, as I say, is a former diplomat. He had a 37-year career as a diplomat dealing with the Middle East, and he served in a range of posts, which included the UAE, Pakistan, the Afghanistan. Also, he was in the UN in New York and served as the British ambassador in Lebanon between 2003 and 2006. And also in Egypt between 2011 and 2014. He retired in 2014, but still remains closely involved with the region, assisting and advising on many of the difficult issues arising out of the security situation. And he also now consults on political risk and alternative dispute resolution within the ambassador partnership. Nadia also has had a very interesting career. She is a London-based journalist and writer. She, between 2010 and 2015, was the senior editor of, and correct my pronunciation if this is off, Al-Sharq Al-Azwar.
Sharq Al-Awsat.
Much better. My son is learning Arabic, but I have no pretensions, so thank you. And she also has contributed regularly to BBC Arabic programmes, Sky News, Radio 4. She's had a daily column in the Al Arab newspaper. And in 2015, she founded and serves as the president of the International Academy of Media and Diplomacy, which is a London-based organisation training and certifying in media and diplomacy. So without further ado, can I hand over to you both? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having us here today. As a media person, and this is how I like to introduce myself all the time, I'm going to start straight to the point. I'm going to go to the news and ask James today about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. This anti-corruption tsunami, is it like a necessary step to go to achieve the 2030 vision? Is it more political? So I think you are in better position to give an explanation. Maybe my role is to give the information, to give the news, but when it comes to analysis, I believe that you are much better. And I'm sure everybody wants to know, because a lot of question marks everywhere in all debate platforms I've seen. Some people are worried, some people are very relaxed about it, and they think that it's good reforms and good time to make change. So what do you think about it?
Nadia is the real expert here, but I'm very happy to try and answer that question. I'm sure all of you have been following the news that last Saturday it was an extraordinary series of events. Following close on what was called Davos in the Desert, a huge sort of top-level investor conference in Riyadh. We had two bits of news. One is the arrest of several very senior, important and wealthy Saudi figures, including members of the royal family, on corruption charges, and the incarceration in a luxury hotel. And that evening, reports of a missile attack on Riyadh, supposedly a missile coming from Yemen, although I think there are doubts about this. And these things alone would have made up a year's news from Saudi Arabia, which is already a very interesting place and a place in transition. But that will happen on one, in a 24-hour space. It sounds, really makes it exceptional. How do we interpret it? There's been a lot of comment. The context is, of course, that you have a very strongly reformist young crown prince in the person of Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the very elderly King Salman, who came to power only last year, came to the throne only last year. and mandated his son, delegated him a great deal of power, essentially to try and galvanize the Saudi government system into responding better to the needs of the young population, young and largely unemployed or underemployed population, who have high expectations of change. And the young prince has done well in that. He has signalled quite a few things, including the fact that next June women will be allowed to drive in the kingdom. He's also signalled all sorts of relaxation of social codes to do with having fun, going to the cinema in mixed groups and so on. So really starting on the journey to bring Saudi Arabia out of its very special category, special social and political category, into something more resembling a modern state. And I think everybody wishes him well with that. He's also set a very ambitious set of targets for the country, something called Vision 2030, in which he's aiming to double the number of people in private sector employment between now and 2020, and then double it again by 2025. I mean, these are extremely ambitious targets because the private sector in Saudi Arabia is limited. It's rather based on large family corporations which have grown up probably over a couple of generations, which do a number of different functions, trading or industry. But there isn't really a very welcoming environment yet for wide-scale public investment, particularly foreign direct investment in Saudi Arabia. He's trying to change that. As I say, we're not there yet. In this context, we see also a huge concentration of power in the hands of the young Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who, in his capacity as defense minister, appears to be the one who decided on the war on Yemen, which began over 2 years ago, and which has caused huge destruction, and which many experts...
sorry, James, sorry to interrupt you, but before going to Yemen and talking about the war in Yemen, before when we talk about the changes in Saudi Arabia, it's always the word generation or generations mentioned. With what's happening now, do you think it's speeding up the time?
It is.
And how do you see it? Something will happen in a couple of years, or people are talking about months, less than a year, we're going to see something.
Yes.
Is that speeding up, or if you give us more details about that, then we go to Yemen.
I think it's speeding up in the sense, but you can't change society like that. You can't just dictate a change in society. These things
Talking about investment, more about investment,
yes.
if we talk about that.
Talk about investment. You have this the long sort of delay, as it were. For a long time, the very old generations, people in their 70s and 80s, were in power. This has leapfrogged an entire couple of generations down now to this young man and his strongest supporters who are in their 30s. So in that sense, it has been a jolt. And there was pent-up change which has been released. But I don't believe societies can change so suddenly. You can give them a kickstart, and there is pent-up demand, as I say. But talk about investment, and I'm coming to that because we all know that for employment, you need quite a few ingredients. You need good education. The Saudi education system has been very lacking, has not produced young Saudis or even middle-aged Saudis with the right kind of skills, professional skills, and it hasn't produced an environment where SMEs can flourish. And we all know that SMEs are the great driver of growth, of employment growth in modern economies. So that hasn't really happened yet.
And do you see what's happened in Saudi Arabia? It's a very unique thing. So it can be a model for the Middle East, for other countries to copy this reform. Because if you compare it about what happened in North Africa and the MENA region before, like talking about 2011 and the Arab Spring, it comes from the people, it comes from the base. But now the reforms are coming from the top. Do you think this can inspire, like Tunisia inspired Libya, then Egypt, Libya, Syria, everything? It was like a domino. Do you think the same thing will happen with Saudi Arabia, or is not possible? It's very unique experience.
It is very unique. Saudi Arabia is such a one-off, and was so unusual in its governance and its society and so on. I don't think it's an inspiration for anybody, because most other countries are much further down the track towards being a balanced modern society, both an economy and a society. So I think, on the contrary, it's not so much an example or an inspiration, but it does have in common with many other countries the idea of technocratic-led change, a government which is empowered by a powerful political leader or powerful political governing class to bring about technocratic change. There's a very good session this afternoon on Egypt, which I hope everybody will come to, which is a great example of that. After the chaos of a couple of years during the Arab Spring in Egypt, order, if you like, has been restored, technocratic government has been empowered, and it's making real progress. In other places, they're trying to do the same thing. The Gulf monarchies have always been autocratic, if you like. Abu Dhabi and the UAE generally is a very good example of an autocratic regime, which actually for decades now has been leading technological change very intelligently and producing very good results without any of what we in the West would consider to be representative political institutions.
Yeah.
So it is working. If it's done well, it works. It's been done over a lot of time as well in the UAE, and they haven't put a foot wrong. But in other countries, it hasn't been so easy.
You went to talk about Emirates now. I'm going to join Emirates with Saudi Arabia, link them together. And how is the situation in Yemen affecting those countries now? And what possible scenarios can we expect in a short term and then in a longer term?
As people probably know, both the Saudi armed forces, but also the Emirates armed forces, have taken part in the war in Yemen. The Emirates have been very bravely in there on the ground and taking casualties and not making a fuss about it. The Saudis have tended to be using air power, but for both, whatever their good intentions, which was really to constrain the ability of Iran to open up a threatening front in Yemen. It wasn't there before. There was the potential for it to be there. They launched this war, which most experts would say is unwinnable. I mean, you've got to know what you want from a war and whether you're actually going to achieve it by military action. And I don't think those conditions were fulfilled at the beginning. It still looks unwinnable. It's been very destructive. And it has led now to Iran actively supporting the various Yemeni forces, mostly the Houthi tribal group of northern Yemenis, but others as well. It has actually led now to an Iranian support for that. So the nightmare they were trying to avoid has been created. So it is, in many ways, an example of what not to do. I very much hope that wise counsels will prevail and that the war will be brought to an end, because it is unwinnable and it is causing a great deal of destruction. And I think there are two features of this. In Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of nationalist pride in the very considerable armed forces of Saudi Arabia taking part in this important, as they see it, important conflict and defending Saudi Arabia. In the Emirates, I think there's more doubt. There's pride that their soldiers have fought well and bravely and taken casualties, but I think there's more doubt about whether this is a good idea. There's a strong Yemeni presence socially in the Emirates, dating from the various wars in the past. And so I think people in the Emirates are quite well informed about the complexity of what's happening in Yemen.
Before moving on and asking you about what's happening in North Africa, you said a sentence of what not to do, but we can see in the region a country of that a lot of people see it as a success story. It's Oman. I would like to ask you about Oman. What's the secret behind keeping themselves away, keeping themselves safe politically, socially, economically? What's behind the story of Oman?
Oman is very lucky geographically because it's slightly apart and it's got its strong cultural and trade links with the Indian Ocean, with East Africa, India, and so on. And it's on the Straits of Hormuz. And it doesn't take part in a lot of the core activities of the other Gulf states politically. And it's always kept the lines open to Iran, quite rightly. They've been very fortunate in a strong and steady leadership under the Sultan. And again, technocratic reform has happened, but it's happened very intelligently. They've had good luck in that they found oil and exploited it, and that paid for some growth. They've had bad luck in that the oil prices have now, of course, sunk to a point where they've got a major budget problem, and they're desperately trying to find employment, including through foreign direct investment. Oman is a good place to do business, but a very traditional place in the sense that there are not many formal mechanisms, regulatory ways of reassuring foreign investors that their investment is safe, will be handled according to a certain way. There's no history of bad problems in Oman for foreign investors, but nor is there the kind of set of modern compliance and regulatory assurances that we would expect. They would like to change that. It's happening quite slowly, and it's happening quite slowly in the other Gulf countries, all of whom want to modernize their economies, they want to diversify away from oil, they want to create private sector employment, including through SMEs, and are being very slow about making the legal changes, the changes in the laws, the investment laws, the special investment laws, the special economic zones, very slow to bring those on stream. It's rather hard to explain why it's so slow when the need for these changes has been evident for years, and they themselves are the first ones to say that.
Thank you. Need of changes, need of new allies in the region. I would like to highlight as well the changes that are happening with Kurdistan, with what's happened in Kurdistan and this new alliance between Turkey, Iraq, Iran. So if you explain more about that, and again, it's affecting the investment, the banks, everything was touching there. So,
I think as many British companies in the region know, Kurdistan has been a good place to go and to invest and trade over the last 20 years because it's had a de facto autonomous status and it's had its ability to export oil, it's controlled, and to pay for things. Even before the very latest troubles, though, those situations were getting worse in that politically there was one family, the Barzani family, which have taken a huge position of power in the country, have upset the sort of sharing of power that was there. A lot of corruption has come in. A lot of foreign companies are now not doing very well because of those conditions. And if that wasn't bad enough, you've now got not the end of the war against Daesh, and it's not quite the end, but Daesh have been defeated largely through the extraordinary bravery and effectiveness of the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, fighting ISIS both up in the northwest of Iraq and all along the Turkish border in Syria. Those have been supported a lot by the United States recently in the sort of single-minded fight against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. But Daesh is almost defeated. The United States no longer has an interest in supporting Kurds. The Kurds have many enemies. The Turkish government, of course, is extremely tough on what they regard as terrorist groups operating in their own southeast, but also over the border in Syria and Iraq. They're not going to stop until they've reasserted some kind of control or severely weakened the Kurdish de facto territorial extent that they have now. The Iranians are not happy with the independence referendum that was held very ill-advisedly about a month ago in Erbil for the Iraqi Kurds, which resulted in a huge, overwhelming vote in favor of independence, but it's quite undeliverable. And the government in Baghdad, having just completed the military operations against Mosul and against Daesh in most of the north and west of Iraq, were free now, and as they have now done, they've rolled their battle-hardened troops into all the territory that the Kurds have been holding provisionally, Kirkuk and so on, pushed them right back, and we don't know when they're going to stop. They could actually, Baghdad could push its forces into the whole of Iraqi Kurdistan, ending the, whatever it is, 25 years of effective autonomy they've had. I don't think they will, but it's becoming a very uncertain situation there. And as I say, the Iranians don't want the Kurds to assert themselves in the cause of independence. So that's pretty bad for the Kurds.
Now we're going to move to North Africa, and I'm going to ask you about what's going on there. If we follow what's going on, we can notice that Britain now is much more interested in North Africa more than ever. And it's been highlighted this morning about the session about Algeria. And at this very moment in Tunisia and in Hammamet, there is this big conference with the British. They had 900 people. They trying to give them trainings, making workshops for young leadership. So they working on that. This afternoon, as you mentioned, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia will be highlighted very well. That's why now I would like to talk about Libya. Libya, it's a great opportunity for investors, even though it's not really settled, the security issue is there, but everybody on standby waiting for the situation to get better. So what's going on?
I agree with you. I think there's a great opportunity in Libya. It was always going to take a few years to settle down after the terrible chaos that followed the 2011 intervention by Britain and France against the Gaddafi regime, which unfortunately opened up a period of civil war, including a very strong assertion of power by the Islamist forces in Libya, which were a minority and still are a minority, but which was soon reinforced by Daesh-type elements from outside, particularly in the last few years. And that really caused a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos in Libya, on top of the fact that the country was already sort of splitting into different interest groups, tribes and rival governments and so on. And the UN doing its best, backed by the European Union and Britain and everybody, to try and get them all to actually recompose the country and to have a central government with effective security, with an effective economic policy, and drawing on the huge reserves that are still available, despite some depletion, in Libya's Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is held outside. And Libya has probably taken longer than any of us expected to get over that crisis, but I think the last 12 months have seen some really very positive signs by which the two rival governments have been reconciled, various disruptive forces. ISIS last summer was defeated in its last stronghold, although it is rallying again, I'm afraid, down in the south. But overall, we're trying to. I think we can actually see the country coming together. It was unfortunate that certain regional powers, plus Russia, supported one element, let's say, in the eastern part of the country it was, of the Libyan rival forces against what the UN was trying to achieve in the capital, in Tripoli, which is a united government involving all parts of Libyan society. I think quiet diplomacy by the UN has overcome that challenge, and I think everybody's agreed now there's no point in fighting anymore, now that ISIS have been more or less defeated there. The time has now come to get on, rebuild the country, exploit the wonderful oil revenues, exploit the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I think the stage is set for real opportunities. There's a very good Britain-Libya Business Council which promotes that kind of investment by British companies, interest by British companies. I recommend them to you, and they're feeling quite bullish as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to ask you if you have any questions for James. Yes, please.
There's so much to cover, but a few words on Qatar's situation and the more recent Lebanon Hezbollah situation.
Thank you.
I think very good question, very important issues. I think both issues are an example of Saudi Arabia flexing its muscles and basically saying, we are now going to be the regional hegemon, you're going to get behind us or else. You're going to stop having even neutral relations with Iran. You've got to confront Iran with us. We are going to confront Iran. We are doing it, and we need everybody on our side. We're not going to tolerate this kind of, sitting in the middle, which Qatar is doing in order to protect itself. It's very exposed to Iranian hostility if it were ever to seek confrontation or allow confrontation. It shares gas fields with Iran. It has to deal with Iran. Oman doesn't want to be dragged into that. But the previous, I won't say government, but the previous power holders in Qatar until recently, were very much backing extremist Islamic power grabs in Egypt and elsewhere. by the so-called Muslim Brotherhood. It's sometimes Muslim Brotherhood, sometimes it's things disguised as Muslim Brotherhood. And this infuriated the Saudis and the Emiratis and others, and indeed a lot of us in the West, who saw that as a real threat to peace and to stability in the region. So Qatar put itself really in the wrong place with Saudi opinion and with the Emirati opinion. It took us slightly by surprise that it came out now, as it were, just in recent months, when actually a lot of the danger had passed, a lot of the danger from Muslim Brotherhood or extremist Muslim political forces had passed. And it's part of this assertion of Saudi strength. I think Qatar will preserve its independence, its autonomy, because it's got the resources to do so. It's quite small. It's well protected by an American military base. Not that's a total barrier to a ground invasion by Saudi or Emirati forces, but it's quite a deterrent. And the Turks, of course, have immediately signed an agreement with Qatar to provide defense of Qatar, and they put their own troops on the ground. So I think Qatar can survive. It'll be difficult. It's suffering from the flight boycott and from the banking boycott. But I honestly don't think there's much. I don't think Qatar can give in. I don't think they can concede on this. It puts them in an impossible position to become a vassal of Saudi Arabia and then be used in the front line against Iran when they're so vulnerable to the slightest counterattack by Iran. So I think Qatar will hang on. Lebanon, which is a very recent development, it's always been there potentially, but just the last few days, as you know, the Saudis have warned not only their nationals to leave Lebanon, but they've told Lebanon, if you carry on allowing Hezbollah to be a part of the Lebanese government, then we're going to destroy you, one way or another, either by sanctions, other measures. I'm sure there had been discussions with Israel about this, because Israel also has a strong interest in destroying Hezbollah, although I don't think they want to do it now, but I think they would love to do it if ever the opportunity appeared. Now, Lebanon is in a terrible situation. The great majority of Lebanese loathe and despise Hezbollah, hate the fact that this group, which although it has its roots in Lebanon, is actually closely allied with Iran, has had its boot on the neck of Lebanon for about 20 years, and they'd love to get out from it. Hezbollah, the only armed group that didn't disarm at the end of the civil war under the Taifa Accord, every armed group was supposed to. Hezbollah didn't, and they indeed have built up their strength to the point that they can pose quite a threat to Israel, and they do so not only to defend Lebanon against further Israeli invasions, of which, as you know, there have been many and very destructive military actions by Israel against Lebanon, but they're doing it on behalf of Iran as well. But to say that you can just somehow remove Iran from the Lebanese equation without destroying Lebanon, and I really mean destroying it, not just morally, but destroying it physically, is fantasy. Hezbollah ministers have been part of the Lebanese governments now for decades. It's completely part of the formula. It's how you share power, it's how you keep the peace in Lebanon. And nobody likes it, but the alternatives are total civil war, which will be won by Hezbollah, or external destruction by Israel or whoever, which would destroy Lebanon as a place to live, but would not destroy Hezbollah. So I think what the Saudis are saying to Lebanon now is totally unrealistic. It totally ignores what everybody knows, what they should certainly know about the fragility of the country, the complexity. And what really troubles me and many people is that it's this endless recourse to threats of war or threats of sanctions. Why don't they try a bit of diplomacy? President Sisi of Egypt said on Wednesday, it's reported as saying on Wednesday to a group of journalists he was talking to, the region's had enough wars, we can't cope with it anymore, and he's absolutely right. The societies are very fragile, the economies are very fragile, there are huge problems, even without wars, there are huge problems facing the societies of communities from Near East and Middle East. And what is now needed is concerted peace building and concerted efforts to overcome environmental, demographic, economic, social challenges of all kinds. So everybody, you can imagine in Beirut, people are even more deeply upset than they are here, very upset at the prospect of another unnecessary, destructive war which could have no possible good result.
Sir, there is, yeah, you had a question? Yeah.
That's it, right. Just going back to the Saudi domestic situation and the jolt of change that you put it, can you talk a little bit about your perception of the risks of a backlash against Mohammed bin Salman and his reforms, and what form such a backlash might take?
I would be very rash if I tried to predict that, because it's all such new territory. There's very little sort of historical evidence to go on. Saudi has never been in this position before. It's already a very unusual kind of state, unusual origins, unusual governance over the last nearly 100 years. But so every new development is a real surprise, and it takes quite a lot of thinking to work out what the prospects are. I think the young people will continue to, the young population, Saudi has a very young population, will continue to back him very strongly. I think he would be wise to ease back on the war in Yemen, ease back and stop it, because I don't think it's going to bring him any credit or anybody any credit. I think the way in which he has, appears to have ordered these arrests and the way in which they've been announced is very damaging to foreign perceptions of the rule of law in Saudi Arabia, because what's the difference between that and any autocrat using corruption trials to send political messages and to deal with political rivals? People would quite rightly, and people are asking, you look around the reports and the comment in the media, investors are really quite worried. What on earth would happen if I invested now under the Vision 2030 scheme, I put lots of money into some nice private sector venture in Saudi Arabia, and then after a few years' time, suddenly the political wind changed, and the person I'm with, or the laws under which I've done this, are suddenly overturned just by a stroke of a pen, by one autocratic decision. So I think it would be very wise if Saudis would try to repair the damage that's already been done and built up a reputation for consistency and for credibility for investors. I'm not the only one. I think every commentator I've read has said this cannot fail to damage the main aim that Mohammed bin Salman had set himself, which was for major private sector investment into Saudi